Hello. Today, we're going to watch and learn from this game between Magnus Carlsen and Daniel Naroditsky with fantastic moves until the end. Let's dive right in. The game begins with Daniel as white opening with pawn to d4, and Magnus responding with knight to f6, a classic start. Daniel develops his knight to c3, and Magnus counters with pawn to d5, setting up a semi-closed position. Daniel continues with bishop to f4, showing his intent to control the central dark squares. Magnus plays pawn to a6, preparing for a potential queenside expansion. White solidifies the center with pawn to e3, while Magnus plays pawn to h6. Daniel advances his pawn to h4, an aggressive move signaling his kingside intentions. Magnus responds with pawn to c5, directly challenging the center. Daniel captures this c-pawn with his d-pawn, and Magnus develops his knight to c6. White develops his knight to f3, continuing natural development, while Magnus brings his bishop to g4, pinning White's knight. Bishop to e2, and Magnus advances his pawn to e6, creating a semi-closed center structure. Daniel repositions his knight to a4, targeting the c5 square. Magnus moves his knight to d7, protecting his options. White plays pawn to c3, strengthening his center, and Magnus immediately captures the c5 pawn with his knight. Daniel's knight on a4 captures Magnus's knight on c5, and Magnus recaptures with his bishop. White then plays knight to d4, and here Magnus's bishop captures White's bishop on e2. Daniel recaptures with his queen, and Magnus castles kingside, securing his king's safety. Daniel follows suit with a queenside castle, showing the opposing castles that often lead to attacking positions. Magnus places his rook on e8, preparing for central action. Daniel moves his queen to g4, applying pressure, and Magnus responds with queen to f6, defending and preparing for counterplay. White's knight returns to f3, and Magnus advances his pawn to b5, starting his queenside initiative. Daniel shifts his queen to g3, and Magnus boldly pushes his pawn to e5. Now Daniel's bishop captures on h6. Magnus recaptures with his queen. White's rook captures on d5, taking advantage of the opened position. Magnus develops his bishop to e7, focusing on piece activity. Daniel brings his rook to d1, doubling rooks on the d-file. Magnus responds by placing his rook on d8, facing off against White's rook. A direct confrontation follows as Daniel's rook captures Magnus's rook, and Magnus recaptures with his bishop. White moves his queen to g4, maintaining pressure. Magnus repositions his queen to e6, preparing for central counterplay. Daniel shifts his queen to e4, and Magnus advances his pawn to f5, challenging the white queen. Daniel's queen moves to d5, forcing an exchange. Magnus's queen captures Daniel's queen, and White's rook recaptures. Magnus develops his bishop to f6, maintaining piece activity. White's rook advances to d6, an aggressive positioning. Magnus places his rook on c8, preparing for counterplay. Daniel pushes his pawn to h5, and Magnus moves his king to f7, beginning his king's journey toward the action. Daniel's rook checks from d7, forcing Magnus's king to e6. White shifts his rook to b7, threatening the b-pawn. Magnus defends by moving his rook to b8. Daniel repositions to c7, and Magnus's king steps to d6, approaching the center. White's rook shifts to f7, applying pressure. Magnus pushes his pawn to e4, creating counterplay. Daniel moves his knight to d2, and Magnus positions his knight to e5, increasing central control. Daniel's rook retreats to a7, and Magnus seizes the opportunity with his knight checking from d3. White's king moves to c2, and Magnus repositions his rook to b6, coordinating his pieces beautifully. Daniel advances his pawn to g4, but Magnus strikes with his knight capturing the f2 pawn. Tactical shot. White captures with his pawn on f5, and Magnus places his king on e5, centralizing it perfectly for the endgame. Daniel pushes his pawn to c4, while Magnus brings his rook to c6, targeting White's pawns. White advances his pawn to b4, but Magnus captures the c-pawn with his b-pawn, creating a dangerous passed pawn. Daniel pushes his pawn to a4, and Magnus advances his pawn to c3, creating serious threats. White moves his knight to b3, and Magnus maneuvers his knight to g4, maintaining the pressure. White advances his pawn to b5, but Magnus strikes with his knight capturing on e3 with check. Daniel's king retreats to b1, and Magnus captures the b-pawn with his a-pawn. White recaptures with his a-pawn, but Magnus pushes his c-pawn to c2, delivering a devastating check. White's king moves to c1. Magnus repositions his rook to d6, maintaining the initiative. Daniel moves his knight to d2, but Magnus's king captures the pawn on f5, adding material. Daniel's rook 4, and Magnus plays bishop to b2 with check. White's king captures Magnus's bishop, and Magnus's rook captures on d2, eliminating a key defender. Daniel pushes his pawn to b6, but Magnus's rook moves to d1. White's rook checks from a5, and Magnus's king moves to f4, avoiding the check. White repositions his rook to c5, but Magnus delivers a decisive rook check from b1. White's king moves to a2, and Magnus's rook captures the b6 pawn. In a final desperate attempt, Daniel pushes his pawn to h6, but Magnus captures with his g-pawn. White's rook captures on c2, but Magnus delivers the final blow with rook to a6 check, and Daniel resigns, unable to prevent further material loss and eventual checkmate. Please don't forget to like and subscribe for more content like this.